Welcome back. It would be hard to find anyone who wants to be taxed more, but what do Canadians think about a price on carbon? Nik Nanos is Chief Data Scientist at Nanos Research. Thanks for being here, Nik.
Great to join you.
So if one of the ways to go about selling a tough policy is to sell it to voters, how are we doing with the carbon tax? What does the Canadian population think of pricing carbon?
You know, it's interesting. It's pretty clear that the Liberals have not done a good job at promoting this. You know, when we ask Canadians whether they think that the carbon tax is an effective or ineffective way to combat climate change, Canadians are 4 times more likely almost to say that it's not effective at combating climate change. And they also don't think that it's an effective way to get people to consume less fuel.
Can you think in your history of gathering this kind of research as a pollster of another example where something this important to get broad spread agreement on has been, I guess we'll call it a failure? It has not been as successful as the folks trying to sell it would like.
Well, why don't we just say that it's a failure so far? Maybe the best example would be when the GST was introduced by the Conservatives. Very controversial. Canadians did not want to pay for the GST, and there was a lot of resistance to that front. It took a lot of time for Canadians to come on board and not necessarily to like the GST, but to accept it. And I think that the one way that this could have a little more traction is if people see that it has an impact on carbon emissions, that we're consuming less carbon. But the thing is, there's a long tail on that one.
For sure. It's a slow-moving issue. We now, of course, expect it to be central to the next election question. And an incoming government will come in on the very question that they will get rid of the so-called carbon tax. Is now the time for, if you're the incumbent and you're trying to hang on to this, is now the time to try to educate people on why it works?
Well, I don't think the Liberals have any choice, because this is part of the election is going to be about this particular tax, because that's what Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives want to fight on. But, you know, if we go into the old time machine, remember in 1993, Jean Chrétien and the Liberals they were also going to axe the tax, the GST, and then they ended up keeping it. So who knows what a politician's going to do? But this, for a government that's politically on the ropes, this is just another difficult issue for them to try to get Canadians to feel good about.
That's such an interesting parallel, isn't it? Because governments can backtrack once they're actually in power. In this case, we haven't heard alternatives advanced. Does that strike you as interesting when there's sort of a negative campaign against an issue, but there's no sort of, but we would do X offered up instead? Yeah.
And, you know, the thing is for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, they got the easiest job in town. They just have to oppose whatever the Liberals are proposing and to try to move forward. You know, the thing is that who knows what might happen if and when the federal Conservatives became the government. Maybe they would change the tax or do something. But, the big question is, I think it's going to probably be fair for average voters to say, okay, you want to axe the tax? Fine. What's going to happen in its place? Or will you just axe it?
Would you agree that the minute we all agreed to call it a tax, we probably were seeing that it would be unpopular and it would be a negative for anybody trying to impose it?
Absolutely. And, the thing is, this particular tax, it impacts people's day-to-day lives.
Right.
It impacts how they heat their homes, how they get to work and stuff like that. So, and it's immediate. It's not like once a year, like income tax. So I shouldn't say once a year like income tax, but it is part of people's everyday lives.
Yeah, a real irritant. So let me ask you this, if we could get in that time machine, would it have been a better policy if it taxed the sources, so businesses, of course, which eventually does always land at the consumer's door, but was less visible, less obvious to us?
Well, politically, it probably would have been better. But the reality is that, whether you're taxing individuals or whether you're taxing businesses, it's inflationary, whether Canadians are paying for it directly or whether they pay for it indirectly. So the thing is for the federal Liberals, they've embarked on this particular tax as part of their environmental strategy. They have to hope that it has some type of positive impact on carbon emissions, because if it doesn't, people are going to say, okay, so we're paying for this tax. I don't see an impact. And that'll make for double trouble for the Trudeau Liberals.
Nik, so good to have you for this. Appreciate your time.
Cheers.
Nik Nanos is Chief Data Scientist at Nanos Research. Time for the takeaway and the seeds of greatness. Big things are usually hard to do, and a problem like climate change is the definition of a big and hard thing. Science is not iffy on the role that carbon's playing in our world. There's too much of it, and Canada has made some promises to other nations that we'll do our part in reducing it. That's even more complicated in a nation like ours than it is in most, given that a huge and valuable part of our economy is also a big part of the carbon problem. Fossil fuels are the key culprit globally, and that means Canada has an outsized price to pay to reduce carbon. It's a lot easier for Finland or even France to live up to CO2 reduction promises without doing damage to their citizens and economies. But the reality doesn't change no matter how hard it is, and the world is pretty quickly, though some would argue not quickly enough, moving towards systems that will equalize our carbon efforts. Things like the EU Border Adjustment Program will reward those who can find a way to produce less carbon, creating incentives and financial reward for behavior that benefits the global community. A price on carbon is one elegant way to manage this problem. It helps us measure it, and it helps us value the cost of having it. In the short term, people who want to continue to use more carbon to fly on a jet, say, or sail on a yacht, will pay for that. In the long run, it creates natural incentives to workarounds, new technology, and new behavior that saves us from having to pay for our carbon footprint. That economic principle is pretty well agreed upon, but a price on carbon has to work in real time with real people, and that requires the courage of our convictions. A carbon price only works if you make it meaningful and its value predictable. My takeaway? Maybe there is a better solution than a price on carbon, in which case, let's hear it fast. But one thing's for sure, doing this in a half-hearted way means we feel the pain without getting any of the reward. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.